I call the Honourable Philip Heatley.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I too rise to support the Conservation Natural Heritage Protection Bill in this third reading. I would like to concur with the member who first presented this bill to the House that it is very much about deterrence. The reality is that many of the species endemic to New Zealand that are traded offshore or otherwise killed here or destroyed in this country are threatened species, that they are dwindling in number, and deterrence really is the only practical way to go. Locking someone up or sending them a $10,000 or $100,000 fine will not bring that species back if it is pushed to the point of extinction due to foul play or, in fact, trade, Mr Speaker. What was interesting about this bill for the committee was that, in fact, as originally submitted, it was to change the penalties and provisions across 5 acts. In doing so, it was informed by 3 other acts, and there is an Act of Parliament which remains untouched by this piece of legislation. And I would like to take members just through those acts. So, originally, as introduced, amendments were proposed to the Conservation Act 87, the National Parks Act 1980, the Reserves Act 1977, the Wildlife Act 1953 and the Wild Animal Control Act 1977. At the second reading, a number of changes were incorporated following select committee process and were confirmed at the committee stage of the full House. And the key change was to include the Marine Mammals Protection Act 1978. So the penalties in that Act are also being changed through this legislation. So 6 acts are being changed there, Mr Speaker. And the committee asked the question about what were the contemporary penalties in recent acts of Parliament where punishments were distributed by judges or handed out by judges. What recent acts were they informed by, or should we be informed by, in setting these penalties? So we looked at 3 current acts in order to make that judgment. The first was the Animal Welfare Act, the Resource Management Act and the Fisheries Act, which outline penalties which are fairly contemporary ones set within recent years in order to set comparable penalties to those people or corporations who were discovered to be basically destroying our fauna and flora. What hasn't come through is that this particular Act does not apply to the Marine Reserves Act. In fact, penalties in the Marine Reserves Act will be addressed through separate legislation to be introduced by the Conservation Minister. So while 3 acts informed the levels of penalty to 6 acts, where in fact the Marine Reserve Act has been left out of this legislation, and rightly so. So the bill now sends a strong message that we take the protection of New Zealand's wildlife and natural areas very seriously. Actions which damage or endanger our wildlife and natural areas put our protected species, our excellent international reputation and tourism industry at risk. And this most comprehensive reform is needed, and the conservation penalties in our legislative history did need updating, and some penalties have not actually changed since the 1970s. So Jackie Dean did a good job here in identifying the need for this legislation. It provides serious consequences now for serious offending. The proposed penalty levels are benchmarked against the other legislation that I outlined. It will deter commercially motivated offending, but will not in any way undermine legitimate commercial activity. It's worth noting that there are a large number of commercial operators on the conservation estate or elsewhere in New Zealand, which come head to head with our natural flora and fauna. They operate legitimately in important tourism businesses, in particular in New Zealand, and they achieve good outcomes that are good for conservation and good commercially. This bill, though, will make it harder for cowboy operators to compete or undermine legitimate concessionaires, those who hold concessions to operate on the conservation estate. So, Mr. Speaker, a good piece of legislation, not put to the House before time. It's a comprehensive bill. It proposes serious consequences, as I say, for serious offending, bigger fines and longer jail sentences for people who endanger our wildlife or damage our protected natural habitats. The current penalties are too low. This raises them. I support this bill.
I call the Honourable Mary Ann Street.
Thank you very much, Mr.